Let's talk Senior Bowl winners and how they impact the Jets on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast for Monday, February 7th, 2021. I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen and now first watch every day, as this podcast is on YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, click the subscribe button. And if you happen to be on YouTube, give it a thumbs up. That helps other people find this channel. Greatly appreciated. Our episode today is brought to you by GetUpside. Just download the free GetUpside app and use promo code TOUCHDOWN to get 25 cents per gallon or more cash back on your first tank. Well, there was football this weekend. The Super Bowl, of course, is this coming weekend, but we had the Senior Bowl on Saturday and the Pro Bowl on Sunday. And I have nothing to say about the Pro Bowl. If you're a Pro Bowl fan, good for you. I had zero interest in that game. However, the Senior Bowl did have much more intrigue because that's the college all-star game where the best prospects go to. But the game itself actually, in some ways, is kind of anticlimactic because there are many scouts who will tell you that what happens during the week is at least as important, if not more important. The practices where the players do drills, go one-on-one, the coaches get to work with them. And I mentioned this last week. I'm not a big fan of focusing on the day-to-day of the Senior Bowl because somebody has a good practice on Wednesday and everybody thinks, well, he's going up the draft boards, his stock has improved a lot, and then that same player may have a terrible practice on Thursday. And also, some of the reporting is selective. You can't watch all the drills at once. So even if you're watching on TV, you may not see the entirety of a player's performance. So I like to wait till the end of the week and kind of get a consensus of the scouts that were there, the media that was there, and get an idea of who did well and who did poorly. And today we're going to talk about who did well. And there are a handful of players that I think were kind of universally viewed as some of the stars of the week. And I want to talk about those players and how their weeks may have impacted the Jets. Now, keep it all in perspective. I said this on Friday. This is just one part of the evaluation process. You had a number of games on tape that these players have all put. You will ahead have the combine. You'll have player visits. There's a lot that goes into player evaluation. So 1 week of practice doesn't necessarily mean everything. But the Senior Bowl does have a degree of significance. And the first player I'm going to talk about was voted one of the offensive linemen of the week. And there was a lot of buzz around him and the Jets, Trevor Penning, who was on the team the Jets coached. He was voted by his peers as the offensive lineman of the week out of Northern Iowa. And for somebody like Trevor Penning, I think the Senior Bowl matters more than it does for other players because this is a small school prospect. This is not a guy who plays against draft talent frequently. And when you're dealing with these small school guys, you don't really know how much their dominance is because they're great and how much of it is because the opposition's not so good. So maybe they're just kind of dominating guys who aren't very good. That doesn't necessarily mean they're on the NFL level. And of course, dominating Senior Bowl week does not necessarily guarantee anything. You may remember the Jets had a guy, Nathan Shepard, a small school guy who had a big Senior Bowl week, got him into round 3, and his career has not been that great. I mean, he's been a rotational guy, pretty solid up till 2021, where he just committed lots and lots of penalties. But it's good to see when a small school prospect goes against comparable competition and plays well. And by all accounts, Trevor Penning did. And there were plenty of reports that Jets coaching staff liked him. Joe Douglas was around him frequently. And listen, this doesn't mean that the Jets are necessarily going to draft him, but I think he got onto some radars. And this was a guy who played tackle in college. He slid inside, played some guard this past week at the Senior Bowl. So there's some buzz. Could the Jets be interested in picking him at 10? Now, you may look at this and say, well, the offensive line is not the biggest weakness on the Jets, which is a good thing. I mean, a couple of years ago, clearly the offensive line was a major issue. So it's nice that the Jets' offensive line has improved the last couple of years. But shouldn't you use your first-round picks to address your biggest weakness? I'd say not necessarily. You have to remember, and this is an example I used last week when I talked about the Bengals. Wide receiver was not necessarily a big weakness for the Bengals a year ago. They had T. Higgins. They had Tyler Boyd. Did Jamar Chase really address a need as big as the Bengals had, wouldn't they have been better served addressing a bigger need on the offensive line? Now, listen, you watch the Super Bowl. If you watch them through the playoffs, you may say offensive line needs work. And yes, it does. But Jamar Chase was the right pick for the Bengals last year. And just because the Jets actually looked pretty solid on the offensive line, that does not necessarily mean offensive line is wrong to pick for them to pick in the early first round. A couple of years ago, I mentioned this when they drafted Mekhi Becton. It's great that the Jets are finally investing on the offensive line again with early round picks. But if you want to build a dominant line, and listen, Mekhi Becton's got plenty of question marks, but now you have Mekhi Becton and you have Elijah Vera Tucker. You've slowly began to build a young core on the offensive line. Again, we're hoping with Becton things work out. We're not guaranteed yet. Last year now raises some question marks about whether Becton's a viable long-term guy for this team. But in theory, the Jets have invested on the offensive line. In theory, they're building an offensive line. But building a dominant offensive line requires you to invest over and over the course of many years. You look at the great offensive lines in this league, there are always exceptions, but typically it's a multi-year process building them, investing a lot of early draft picks, building young talent that develops around each other. So would the Jets necessarily be wrong to draft Trevor Penning at 10? I mean, I'm not going to say the Jets should draft any specific player, and if they don't, this is a disaster, but I can see the case for it because you want to build as strong of a team as possible around Zach Wilson. And the Jets are going to head into this offseason, and there are kind of two different paths they could take, and I think both are viable. I don't think anybody can complain if you try and improve the defense because this defense has to get better. This defense this past year was nowhere near good enough. But you also want to make sure Zach Wilson has as strong of a team as possible. Now, I think the Jets have given Zach Wilson a workable supporting cast, but we're talking about your young franchise quarterback, the guy you hope will develop into your franchise quarterback. Is workable really the best you can do? You want this team to be as strong as possible. You want them to have a great receiving core, and you want them, more than anything, to have a great offensive line, as much as any reason, because you want to make sure Zach Wilson's protected. Again, this player is so important to your franchise. You want to make sure that you have guys blocking for him so he's not taking big hits. But also, a good offensive line can help build a run game that can help support him. You have a strong run game, that can be a very good thing for a young quarterback. So, is the Jets' offensive line good enough right now? I actually would argue, yeah, I think it is. But you don't need to stop at good enough. You can build something dominant. And if Trevor Penning, and listen, we still have a long way to go. There is now some buzz. I'm sure there will be buzz about other players as we get closer to the draft. But I think that if the Jets drafted offensive line in the first round, there would be an outcry from a certain portion of the fan base. I don't know that I agree with that because I think you got to continue building around Zach. I think you want this team as strong as possible around Zach Wilson because when you're dealing with a young quarterback, you don't want to put a ton on his plate. You don't want it to be the way it was with Sam or the way it was with Geno, or even the way it was with Mark Sanchez his last 2 years with the team. You don't want him to constantly have to make difficult plays from a crumbling pocket and making a tight window throw. You want to make things as easy as possible, and one way you do that is to build a strong offensive line. And Trevor Penning is now kind of the name that's getting a lot of buzz around the Jets after his good week. I think it was a very positive week. I think, again, anytime you have a small school prospect who performs at the Senior Bowl, it's a very good week for him. So Trevor Penning's the first name to kind of keep an eye on, a big winner. And again, with all the buzz about the Jets working with him, about the Jets liking him, definitely a name to watch going forward. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I'm going to talk about a couple more names to look at from a position of much greater need than the offensive line. That's ahead here on our Monday episode of Locked On Jets. You know, I'm sure Trevor Penning has earned plenty of Built Bars based on his performance over the weekend and last week at practices. And you should know that Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar on the market. It's February. You've probably given up on your New Year's resolution, but Built Bar makes it easier to get back into it because, again, these may be protein bars, but they taste like candy bars. These are covered in 100% real chocolate. They're low calorie. They're high protein. You can replace your candy bars with these. Most bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar, which usually has around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. And there are so many delicious flavors. You've got mint brownie, you've got coconut almond, and new for this month, white chocolate cookies and cream. They're all delicious, and new flavors are coming out all the time. If they think a flavor might be good, they'll make it. It will be delicious and good for you. And you can check those out at built.com. Again, that's built, BUILT.com, Built Bar. Absolutely delicious protein bars that taste like candy bars. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen and your first watch now each day, as this show is now on YouTube. If you like what you see, hit the subscribe button. You'll never miss an episode. And give this a big thumbs up. We certainly do appreciate that. On today's episode, we're talking winners at the Senior Bowl and how they may impact the New York Jets. I think if you're taking a stock of this roster, you may say tight end is the weakest position. The Jets don't really have anything at there. This past year, they've had Tyler Kroft, they had Brian Griffin, they had Trevon Wesco. Not a great group at the tight end position. And beyond that, tight ends does have significance in this offense because this is a run game that's really based on getting outside. You want your tight ends to be able to seal the perimeter. And I have to admit, I have a kind of a bias when it comes to tight ends. I like game-breaking receiving type tight ends. I think that's kind of the direction the NFL is going in. I like the guys who are complete mismatches. For me, blocking is not quite as important, but the Jets offense works a little bit differently. I do think blocking matters. I think the Jets are looking for more of a complete tight end. Now, listen, they don't want guys who are essentially third tackles. They want guys who can block, but they also want guys who are going to be able to go out there and make plays in the receiving game. But they're not going to go for the guys, you may remember years and years ago, the Saints had Jimmy Graham, or maybe, a guy with the Dolphins right now is going to be a free agent, Mike Gesicki. Those are more like wide receiver types. They're listed as tight ends technically, but really they play the role more wide receivers. The Jets want guys who can both block and catch, and I think that they'd be willing to sacrifice a little bit of game-breaking ability in the passing game if you can do both, if you can block and you can catch. And a couple of guys really stood out this week, and Ron Middleton was coaching the team. Ron Middleton was the head coach of the team the Jets were working with this week. Robert Saleh was there in an advisory role, but they decided that they wanted to get some less experienced coaches, some action in more prominent roles, so they kind of called guys out. Ron Middleton, Riverboat Ron Middleton, who coached the Jets to victory against Jacksonville, was actually the head coach of this team, and he's the Jets tight end coach. He had a lot of very positive things to say about the tight end group this week. By all accounts, everything I could find, everything that I saw, this was a week where the tight ends collectively did a very good job. But there were two who kind of stood out, and one of them has kind of been, as far as I can tell, the consensus top tight end in this year's class. And that's Trey McBride out of Colorado State. But there's also Jeremy Ruckert out of Ohio. Trey McBride out of Colorado State. But there's also Jeremy Ruckert out of Ohio State. Ruckert's kind of an interesting case because his numbers aren't that great, but he played in that Ohio State offense where they have lots of good options in the passing game. You've got Garrett Wilson. You've got Chris Olave. And one of the things you see sometimes in the NFL draft is there's a tight end who doesn't have great numbers but does have potential as a wide receiver, essentially has the potential to be a better pro player than he was a college player. A guy I looked at a couple of years back, Dawson Knox, who played at Mississippi, his receiving numbers weren't that great, but you could see the potential on film when he got an opportunity. You could see the way that he moved. And with Dawson Knox, he was on a team that had A.J. Brown and D.K. Metcalf, so you could understand why he wasn't used in the passing game. And that's one thing you got to remember. Stats are not the end-all when you're evaluating college prospects. There's so much context that stats lack. I'm not saying stats are irrelevant, but you can't always just scout by the box score because there are some guys who produce more in the NFL because they're put into a better situation. Now, with these guys, and I think the Jets probably are going to take a tight end somewhat early. Now, you look at guys like McBride and Ruckert, they're day two prospects. I don't think there are day one prospects in this draft, and at least none that you would think to take in the top 10. And to be honest with you, I'm okay with that. I think the NFL actually does not do a great job at evaluating tight ends because the guys who develop into elite tight ends are usually not the first round picks. You got Gronk, who was a second rounder. A bit of a different situation because he was coming off an injury. He did not play his last year in college, which dropped him. But you got guys like Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz, who were day two picks. George Kittle was a fifth round pick. Meanwhile, the guys who get a ton of hype, sometimes they're very good players, but they're not the best tight ends in the NFL. I think you go back to 2006, Vernon Davis, who was a solid player, but I don't think was ever in that elite tight end discussion. Or if he was, it was very brief. Or Eric Ebron back in 2014, O.J. Howard a few years ago. These are guys, every few years there's some guy who's going to be, people use the phrase generational, this guy's going to redefine the tight end position. And they go high in the first round. And even when they're decent players, they don't redefine the position. Now, Kyle Pitts might be the exception to that. Kyle Pitts had an excellent rookie year, so maybe Kyle Pitts will be the exception that proves the rule. But in general, I'm kind of against taking a tight end in the first round anyway, because the guys who always get the hype tend not to be the greatest tight ends who develop. Meanwhile, guys taken on the second day, they tend to be the really top tight ends in the NFL. Now, are McBride and Ruckert on that path? I don't know. And I think part of it will come down to athletic testing. Tight ends are not easy to find in this league. The top tight ends are not easy to find because you have to think about all the different things a great tight end does. In some ways, they're kind of like an offensive lineman because they block. And that's especially true in this Jet system because, again, this system in many ways is kind of built around the perimeter run. You want to be able to have somebody who seals the edge, but you also need somebody who can make plays in the passing game because that sets up play action. You want a security blanket for your quarterback in the middle of the field. So not so easy. And tight ends have to know how to run routes. They have to have good hands. And sometimes you will. Now, the Jets, I don't think are going to do it as much as other teams, but sometimes you will flex your tight end out. You'll put him in the slot. You'll stick him out wide. So tight ends need to learn all the different receiver routes in addition to knowing how to block, in addition to knowing the tight end routes. Very difficult position to find. But it's good to hear that Ron Middleton likes some of the guys because the Jets have to get better. Now, is tight end the most important position in the NFL? Absolutely not. And that's one thing to consider when you're talking about needs. Worst position does not necessarily equal biggest need. Tight ends tend to not make that big of an impact. It's not as big of an impact position as, say, wide receiver is. But there's no question the tight end play hurt the Jets this past season, and they need to get better. Now, I will say this. I think that the Jets should also look to sign a tight end in free agency. I always like signing players to address needs in free agency because it makes you less desperate going into the draft. But you also have to remember what I just said about how difficult it is to learn the tight end position in the NFL. I don't want to depend on a rookie. And it's an interesting free agent class because there are guys who are decent players who bring certain things to the table. I don't think there's a complete tight end in free agency, but depending on what the Jets value, they can find somebody who's going to be an upgrade. And I guess when you get to the offseason, it's not the worst thing in the world to have Croft, Griffin, Wesco as your tight end group because almost anybody you sign could be an upgrade. So the Jets are going to have a very good chance to upgrade this unit. And I still think, though, you always look to add players in the draft, but I'd like somebody in the Jets draft to be maybe the second tight end. I don't love the idea of drafting somebody to be the starter. That said, if somebody's there at good value, you take them. And it sounds like, by all accounts, the tight ends played well this past week in Mobile, and Rod Middleton, the tight ends coach, was very impressed. So perhaps some positivity on the way at the tight end position. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I'm going to talk about one more position group. And this is not a position I would expect the Jets to draft, but it will impact them. We'll continue here on this Monday episode of Locked On Jets. The Jets coaching staff worked last week with plenty of players who have upside. And today I want to tell you about the Get Upside app. Everyone who buys gas needs to know about it. My listeners are earning cash back for every gallon of gas every time they fill up. Just download the free Get Upside app in the App Store or Google Play right now and use promo code TOUCHDOWN for 25 cents per gallon or more on your first fill up cash back. Don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Get cash back using Get Upside. Just download the app for free and use promo code TOUCHDOWN for 25 cents per gallon or more on your first tank. Some people who drive a lot are making as much as $200 or $300 a year in cash back, and there's no catch. The cash back gets added right to your account. You can cash out anytime to your bank account, PayPal, or an e-gift card for Amazon and other brands. Just download the free Get Upside app and use promo code TOUCHDOWN to get 25 cents per gallon or more cash back on your first tank. That's promo code TOUCHDOWN using the Get Upside app. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Monday, talking about the Senior Bowl, which just concluded Saturday in Mobile, Alabama. The past week, the Jets coaching staff was working with a number of the prospects. And I'm going to conclude the show by talking about a position the Jets are not going to draft early this year, and that's the quarterback position. But quarterbacks have significance for the Jets this year. Why? Because they're sitting there at 4 and they're sitting there at 10. And if somebody's good enough, there may be a team that's looking to trade up. And the Jets may be able to get a stockpile of extra picks, which they certainly could use to build up this roster. Even though the Jets have a lot of draft capital this year, as much as any team in the NFL, I think you can always use more draft picks, especially when you're working from where the Jets are, where this roster needs so much retooling. A few extra picks would certainly help. And who knows, maybe you can even add an extra first-round pick or an extra second-round pick next year and increase your draft capital stockpile for 2023. It certainly would help the team out. But the problem is that this is viewed as a pretty weak quarterback class. So you need somebody to really impress teams between now and the draft. And the reports from Mobile were that there were 2 quarterbacks who kind of stood out. Malik Willis from Liberty, very talented guy, and then Kenny Pickett, the quarterback from Pittsburgh. I think when you're talking about the trade down game, because everybody always wants the Jets to trade down and get extra picks, it's a little tricky because you may look at a certain situation and say, well, there's nobody there I really want. The Jets should trade down. Well, it's easier said than done, because if there's nobody there you really want, that makes it more difficult to trade down, because you got to give up something to get nothing. Or, I'm sorry, you got to give up something to get something. You can't get something for nothing. Meanwhile, if there's like a great blue chip prospect available where the Jets are picking, you may say, well, don't trade down. I want this guy. Well, that's the situation where you actually get a pretty good return in the trade down, because other teams are going to be intrigued by a blue chip prospect. Again, you have to give up something to get something. I think the reason people gravitate to a situation like where the Jets are in and where there's a quarterback available is that that's kind of a situation where you're getting something for nothing. The Jets don't really have any interest in a quarterback this year because they have Zach Wilson. But to another team, a quarterback could be very valuable. So that's the type of situation where maybe you could stockpile extra draft picks and not really lose anything, because you don't want a quarterback. You don't need one. And another teams also might be willing to pay a premium. Teams tend to pay more trading up for a quarterback than they do for other positions because of the importance of the quarterback position. So I think for the Jets, it's obvious that the best case scenario for them is one of these quarterbacks really impresses some teams and a team looks to move up, and you're able to get extra picks as a result of a trade down. Now, will it happen? I don't know. Again, this is on paper looking like a pretty weak year at the quarterback position, but it's difficult to say. I mean, in 2017, the Mahomes year, the perception from a lot of people was that it was a weak quarterback year, and that's where Mahomes went. It was maybe the best quarterback in the NFL today. So you never know, and it only takes one team to fall in love. Now, the last time the Jets were really in this position, drafting relatively early in a year where they felt pretty set at quarterback, I think that was 2019. They drafted third overall that year. That was the year they picked Quinnen Williams. And the reason it seemed especially urgent that they should be looking to trade down is they lacked a second round pick that year, because the year before that was when they had traded up for Sam Darnold, and they gave up their 2019 second round pick. But it was a bad quarterback year. It was a year where that was not viewed as very strong at the position. And Kyler Murray went number one overall. He looks pretty good. But beyond that, you don't really have a lot of guys from that class who are looking that great. And there really was not much of a market for the Jets to trade down. And I don't think there was a lot of will for the Jets to trade down anyway. But they were not able to, and they did not move down. And they ended that year without a second round pick. Things are a little bit better this year for the Jets. They're not in need of trading down. I think you could clearly justify staying where you are. But if some team overwhelms you with a trade package, I think that you could argue that's the best case scenario, because this is a draft class that doesn't seem like it had a ton of really top end talent. So the best opportunity to trade down and get an extra pick and maybe get an extra number one pick in 2023 is for one of these quarterbacks to just make a team fall in love with them. And maybe that team's willing to give up a big package, and the Jets will be able to even increase their draft capital still, and it could help them along with this rebuild. Anyway, that's the hope. We'll see what happens. But I think the two standouts from this week who are guys to keep your eye on are Malik Willis out of Liberty and Kenny Pickett out of Pittsburgh. And, if one of them can improve their draft stock to the point where the Jets are getting a big offer to trade down, that could be a best case scenario for this team. Anyway, that's all for our show today. Thank you for listening. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Show's now available on all platforms and always free. If you like what you see, click the subscribe button. And if you're on YouTube, give it a big thumbs up. Have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.